Tonight we are going to walk very slowly through one ordinary day in a small New England village in the year 1712. A world of woodsmoke and candlelight, a world that asks nothing of you. If these quiet journeys into the past help you drift off, it would mean a lot if you subscribed. There is a new episode waiting every week. Let us begin. Long before first light, the village lay under a low roof of dark. Frost had come down in the night and settled on every shingle in the lane. The river ran black beneath a thin skin of ice. Nothing moved. In those days, a village at that hour was a gathering of held breath, steep roofs, and banked fires waiting together for morning. You would not have heard a single voice from the road. You would have heard the wind in the bare elms, and beneath the wind, the hush of sleeping fields. The houses kept their warmth close, the way a man keeps a coin in his fist. The dark was not empty. It was resting. Picture one farmhouse near the meeting house road, low and broad, its clapboards silvered by weather. The beams inside had been hewn by hand, squared with an axe and an adze, and you could read every stroke in the wood. The house smelled of cold ash, of wool, of apples in the cellar below. Upstairs, the children slept beneath heavy coverlets, 2 and 3 to a bed. The dog lay curled by the door. The whole house breathed together in the dark, slow and even, like one animal keeping itself warm. The house was quiet. The goodwife woke first, as she always did. She woke without a bell and without a word, the way a body wakes when it has kept the same hours through every season of its life. The champs was bitter cold, and her breath showed faintly above the coverlet. She rose, drew her wool shawl from the peg, and wrapped it twice about her shoulders. The floorboards were like river stones under her feet. She did not light a candle. Her feet knew the way. The stairs creaked once. Every morning she would go first to the hearth, because the hearth came before everything. It was the heart of the house in more than name. It cooked the meals, dried the stockings, warmed the children, and held the household together at its center like the hub of a wheel. Its stones had been worn smooth by generations of knees. A hearth in those days was wide enough to stand in, a cavern of blackened stone and iron. Above it hung the crane, a hinged iron arm that swung out over the room. From the crane hung the great kettle, waiting. Everything waited at that hour. The whole day was folded up inside the ash, small and dark, ready to be opened. She knelt on the hearthstone and took up the fire shovel. The evening before, as on every evening of her life, she had banked the fire. She had raked the living coals into a heap at the back of the firebox. She had buried them under a blanket of their own ash. Ash is a faithful keeper. It holds the heat in and holds the air out, and a well-banked fire will sleep beneath it all night, patient as a seed under snow. Now, slowly, she drew the gray cover back, one careful pass of the shovel at a stroke. The ash whispered against the iron. A faint warmth rose against her wrists. Then a color came up out of the gray, deep orange, dim as a coal at the bottom of a pond. The fire had held. It always had. She bent low and blew, one soft breath and then another. The coals brightened with each breath and dimmed between them, pulsing like something alive, because it was something alive. She sheltered it with her palm. She fed it the way you feed any small living thing, a little at a time. First, the splinters of fat pine she had split the evening before, thin as straws. Then curls of birch bark that caught with a small, dry sound. Then, kindling the thickness of her finger, laid crosswise, and at last 2 sticks of seasoned oak from the wood box. The flame climbed from one to the next, like a hand climbing rungs. The first heat reached her face. Light moved out across the hearthstone. The room's shadows stepped back into the corners and settled there. The wood ticked softly. There is a particular smell to that first fire of the morning, and the people of that place knew it the way we know our own names. Cold ash, then pine smoke, then the sweetness of oak catching, all of it braided together. Under the smoke lay another smell, softer and rounder. On the table, by the wall, beneath a linen cloth, sat the bread sponge she had set the evening before. Flour, water, and a saved piece of yesterday's leaven had worked all night in the wooden bowl. It had risen under the cloth like a field mouse asleep. She lifted the linen, pressed one knuckle into the dough, and nodded to herself. The sponge was alive, too. Everything in that house that mattered had been left alive, overnight, banked and covered and waiting. Good bread starts in the dark. She swung the crane out, hooked on the kettle, and swung it back over the young flames. The water inside had come from the well the evening before and wore a lace of ice, which the fire would take away soon enough. She stirred cornmeal into a second pot for the morning's porridge, samp and milk, the plain food of the country. Later, there would be bread baked in the brick oven beside the hearth, and cider drawn from the barrel in the cellar. It was not a rich table. It was a steady one, and in that place, steadiness was the greater wealth. The porridge would be plain. It would be enough. Beyond her shoulder, the one small window began to show itself, a leaded sash of little diamond panes, each pane furred with frost. The frost had grown overnight into ferns and feathers on the glass, a white garden that no one had planted. Behind it, the sky had turned from black to the color of pewter. She could see her own fire faintly doubled in the panes. Out in the village, other chimneys were beginning their own thin threads of smoke. One by one, each one a household waking. No one had spoken yet. The morning was being made quietly, in a dozen kitchens at once, by a dozen pairs of hands that had done it 10,000 mornings before. Down the lane, the miller's house showed one lit window. The smith's chimney was already breathing. Every fire in the village was a kept fire. Each had come from another. Some had crossed the ocean as embers in a box of sand. Some mornings, though, before she knelt, there was a small cold doubt in her. She would pause with the shovel in her hand and wonder whether the coals had held through the night. It was never a loud thought. It was the size of a pin. But a fire gone dead in the firebox meant a hard beginning, striking flint against steel over a tinderbox with stiff fingers, or sending a child down the lane to a neighbor's hearth with an iron skillet to carry home borrowed embers under a cover of ash. In those days, no one owned a match, for there was no such thing. Fire was not made so much as it was kept, handed along from hour to hour like water carried in cupped hands. To lose it, even for a morning, felt like a small failure of keeping. She never said this to anyone. She only felt it in the moment before the shovel touched the ash, a little catch beneath the breastbone. Then it passed. And every morning the ash answered her. She would draw back the gray cover, and the orange eyes would open in the dark, and the doubt would close like a door. This same fire, or the daughter of it, had burned on this hearthstone since the house was raised. Her mother had banked coals in just this way, in another kitchen, with this same motion of the wrist, and her mother's mother before her, back in a parish across the sea. When this house was new, embers had been carried to it in a covered pan from the old place, so that the first fire here was not a stranger, but a descent. She was not making a fire, she was continuing one. Her hands were only the newest hands in a line of hands, and the coals beneath the ash were older than anyone who had ever warmed themselves at them. The fire had been kept for her. Now she kept it forward. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. The line held. You do not measure such a morning in hours. The people of that village hardly measured it at all. The fire told them what came next, and the light told the fire. There is a rhythm below the reach of clocks, and they lived inside it the way a fish lives in a river, without once thinking of the water. She laid the board with wooden trenchers and pewter spoons. She set the salt in its small cellar at the center of the table. She banked her worries the way she banked her coals, covered over, held warm, kept for another day. Upstairs, she could hear the first stirrings, a cough, a creak, small feet finding cold floorboards. The house was waking into a room, already warm, already lit, already smelling of smoke and dough. She would wake them soon. Not yet. She let them have the last of their sleep. They would never wonder how. Children never do. The warmth would simply be there, the way it had always been there, because someone had knelt in the dark and made it so. So it had always gone. She stood a moment, with her hands folded under the shawl, watching the flames take hold of the oak. The kettle began its first low murmur. The frost ferns on the window had already begun to soften at their edges, thinning to water at the touch of the room's new warmth. Outside, the pewter sky was lifting toward gray. The light grew slowly. Her shawl loosened at her shoulders. Her breath no longer showed. Beyond the window, the barn stood dark and still. The fire was drawing well. The kettle murmured on. The dough rose under its cloth. The day had begun the way every day began, on the knees, in the quiet, with a handful of kept fire. It asked nothing more of her than that, and she asked nothing more of it. She was still for a breath, and satisfied. The village around her went on waking, chimney by chimney, in the same unhurried order as always. Then the door latch lifted at the far end of the kitchen, iron cold under a thumb. Her husband stood in the doorway in his greatcoat, a candle lantern in his hand, its small flame steadied behind horn panes. He nodded to her, and she nodded back, and no word passed because none was needed. He opened the door on the blue-gray morning, and the cold came in for a moment like a visitor, and then the door closed behind him. Through the frost-softened panes, she watched the lantern light go swinging away from the house, out across the frozen dooryard, toward the deeper dark of the barn. The animals were waiting there, warm in their stalls. First light was coming. The fire held, and the morning went out to meet the day, one small flame carried in a careful hand. The lantern went ahead of him across the dooryard, a small warm room of light carried in one hand. Its panes were thin sheets of horn, and the candle behind them wavered with each step. Frost had stiffened the mud into ridges overnight, and his boots broke the puddle ice with small, clean sounds. The stars were going out. The sky above the barn roof had lightened to the color of skimmed milk. His breath rolled out ahead of him and drifted back over his shoulder. The cold pressed at his face and found the gap at his collar. He did not hurry. A man who does the same walk every morning of his life learns the pace that fits it. The barn stood at the end of the path, big-shouldered and dark, older in its manner than the house. It had been raised in one day by 40 neighbors, or so his father had told it. The story was better than any deed on paper. He believed it. The timbers bore the marks of many axes. He lifted the wooden latch and put his shoulder to the door, and the door swung slowly on its cold iron hinges. The smell met him before the warmth did. Hay, first of all, dry and sweet. A whole summer folded up and stored under the roof. Somewhere in it lay the clover of one particular week of haying, and he could almost name the field. Then the animals themselves, warm hide and warm breath. Then old timber and leather, and the faint sharpness of the stable floor. It was not an unpleasant smell. To him it was hardly a smell at all. It was simply the barn, the way the sea is simply the sea to a fisherman. He stepped in and drew the door to behind him, and the morning wind stayed outside. The barn took him in. Inside, the dark was warmer and had a body to it. He hung the lantern on its nail, well away from the hay, as his father had taught him and as he had taught his own sons. The light reached out and found the animals one by one. The 2 oxen lay in their stalls, great patient hills of muscle, chewing over yesterday's hay with their eyes half closed. Their breath came slow and deep, twin clouds in the lantern light. The straw rustled under them. The cow stood in her place already, heavy with milk, swinging her head around to watch him come. A few hens muttered from the beams above. The barn cat poured itself down from the loft ladder and took up its post by the milking stool. Everyone knew the order of things. The order was old. No one questioned it. Every morning he would go first to the cow. He set the 3-legged stool down at her flank and settled onto it and set the wooden pail beneath her. Then he leaned his forehead against her side, into that broad, warm wall of hide, the warmest place in the parish at that hour. Her belly rumbled against his skull like far-off weather. His hands were cold, so he warmed them first against her, out of courtesy. She stamped once and settled. Then he began. The first jets of milk rang against the dry wood of the pail, high and bright, a sound like rain on a roof. Steam rose faintly where the milk struck. As the pail filled, the note deepened and softened into a steady, wet rhythm. Froth rose at the edges. The cat sat watching with its tail wrapped around its feet, and in the fullness of the morning it was given its saucer, as it was given it every morning. The cow pulled hay from her rack and chewed. Her warmth came through his forehead and spread down his neck. Of all the work of the farm, this was the piece most like rest. He was in no hurry, neither was she. There is a kind of thinking a man's does with his head against a cow, and it is unlike any other. It moves at the speed of the milk. He thought about the wood pile, which wanted splitting. He thought about the fence along the low meadow, where the frost heaved the posts a little more each winter. He thought about harness leather that wanted oiling, and a barn door hinge that wanted the smith, and seed corn in the loft that wanted looking over. He thought about the cider barrels and the loose board on the corn crib. He thought of his eldest boy, old enough now to swing an axe properly. The thoughts came in single file, unhurried. He turned each one over the way you turn a tool in your hand and set it down again. None of it would run off. The pail filled, the barn breathed around him. The morning went on filling with gray light at the cracks of the doors. When the milking was done, he covered the pail and set it high on a shelf, away from the cat, whose account was already settled. Then he took up the fork and climbed the ladder into the loft. Above, under the roof, the hay lay banked to the rafters, and his fork bit into it with a dry rustle. He pitched it down through the trap in forkfuls, and the dust of summer rose around him and turned in the lantern light below like slow snow. The oxen heaved themselves up for it, their joints cracked like green wood. He came down and filled their manger, and forked hay to the cow, and dipped a wooden measure of shelled corn from the bin for the hens. The measure was worn to silk at its rim. His grandmother's initials were cut into its side. 2 letters, gone shallow with handling. He never noticed them anymore. His thumb knew where they were. He scattered the corn, and the hens came down from the beams like falling fruit. They ate in a busy circle. The corn was gone in a moment. He worked through the small remaining offices of the morning in their usual order. He broke the ice on the water trough with the heel of the fork. The water showed black beneath. He looked over the oxen's yoke, where it hung on its pegs, and ran a thumb along the smooth, worn bows. He took the harness down from its nail and worked the leather between his hands, feeling for cracks at the folds, for stitches gone soft. The leather was cold and stiff and smelled of oil and animal. It would ease as the day eased, so would he. Outside, the light was strengthening. Through the gaps between the boards it came in low, flat blades, and chaff drifted through them, kindling as it crossed. Dust and light made their patient trade in the cold air. The barn stood quiet around all of it, keeping the warmth of its animals the way the house kept the warmth of its fire. But some mornings, with the fork in his hands, a heavier thought settled on him, and this was one of them. The work of a farm is never finished. He knew this the way he knew the weight of his own boots, and mostly he carried it without noticing. Every fence he mended began quietly unmending itself the day he walked away from it. Every wood pile burned down. Every field wanted plowing again the moment it was reaped. The stone walls he had built with his own back would want rebuilding since day, heaved apart stone by stone by the frost, patient as anything. A man could put his whole strength into this ground for a lifetime and leave no task done for good. Some mornings that thought sat on his shoulders like a wet coat. He stood a moment at the manger with his hands at rest on the fork. The oxen ate. The lantern hissed faintly on its nail. The thought stayed. His father had stood in this same barn with the same wet coat on his shoulders and had known it in the way fathers know. One such morning, years back, the old man had watched him fret at a gate that would not hang true, mended twice and sagging again. His father took the fork from his hands before he spoke, unhurried as always. "A farm is not a thing you finish," he said. "It is not a house frame to be raised and roofed and done with. It is a thing you keep. You milk today, and you milk tomorrow, and the milking is not a failure to be done milking. The keeping is the point," he said. Then he handed the fork back and went to the corn bin, and that was the whole sermon. The old man was gone now, past his laboring years, and resting at last. But the saying had stayed in the barn like a smell in the timber. The sun had come to see the sense of it slowly, over years, the way you come to see a field in fog. It took the years it took. He took up the fork again. The heaviness did not so much leave as fold itself away, banked like a coal in its proper place. The farm did not need to be finished. It needed to be kept, and here he was keeping it. The cow was milked. The mangers were full. The trough was open water. The harness would take its oil by evening. You do not ask more of a morning than that. He looked down the row of stalls at the slow clavatas of animals, all of them fed by his hands as he was fed by their labor, the whole barn one circle of keeping. The circle did not close, it turned. That was its nature and his. He was content with that. He stood still at the door for a moment before he opened it, listening. Hens at the corn, hay being ground down by broad, patient teeth. The small tick of the lantern cooling as he took it from the nail. He had heard this same morning 1,000 mornings running, and it had worn smooth in his hearing the way the corn measure had worn smooth in his hand. He was a quiet man, and he would not have called any of this by a large name. It was chores. It was the barn before breakfast. All the same, he lingered in it for the space of a breath. The moment asked nothing. Then he lifted the latch and stepped out into first light. The frost on the dooryard had gone silver, and the house across it showed a lit window and a tin chimney, standing its smokes straight up into the still air. Breakfast would be on the board soon, porridge and bread and cider. There would be grace said over it, brief and familiar. He blew out the lantern candle, for the day could carry itself now. Down the lane past the meeting house, a deeper red light was already awake and working. The smith kept earlier fire than anyone. If you had stood in the lane at that hour, you would have heard it, faint and regular under the morning. Iron talking to iron. The smith was at his anvil. The farmer heard it too, and knew the day was properly begun. He carried the milk toward the house, walking his same unhurried walk. The village was rising all around him, fire by fire, chore by chore. Somewhere a well sweep creaked. Somewhere a door closed softly. The circle turned on. Down the lane, past the meeting house with its frost-furred steps, the smithy sat low under its wide roof. It had been awake before anything else in the village, while the farmhouses were only beginning their first threads of smoke. Red light had been seeping between the shutterboards of the shop for an hour. The smithy kept its own dawn indoors and started it early. No one minded. If you had passed by in the half-dark, you would have felt the building before you saw it. A faint warmth reached out across the lane. Under it rode a smell of charcoal and scorched iron. That smell soaked the timbers of the shop and never left them. It was in the smith's coat and in his beard. It followed him to meeting on the Sabbath, faithful as a dog. The shop was never wholly cold. There was, perhaps, a boy in that shop, an apprentice of 12 or 14 years, bound over by his father to learn the trade. Picture him at the bellows in the early light, sleeves rolled, face already shining. He had slept in the loft above the shop, where the warmth of the forge gathered under the roof. That was the one luxury of his station. He had been up before the smith. That was the bargain of his place, and he knew it without being told. The loft ladder was cold. The floor was colder. The forge fire had been banked overnight under its own ash, in the same manner as every hearth in the village. The boy's first office of the morning was to wake it. He raked back the gray blanket, found the living orange beneath, and fed it fresh charcoal from the bin. Then he took hold of the bellows pole and began. The bellows were taller than the boy. 2 great leather lungs, ribbed with wood, hung from the beam beside the forge. Pulling the pole drew them open with a wheeze. Easing it back drove their breath into the fire's throat. There is a rhythm to bellows work. It cannot be hurried and it cannot be skipped. The boy had it in his arms, the way a rower has the stroke. Down and back, down and back. With each breath of air, the coals brightened, going from dull red to orange to a trembling yellow at the heart. Between breaths they dimmed again. Brighten and dim, brighten and dim. The fire breathing because the boy breathed for it. The shop filled with the sound of it, a slow leather sighing. It never varied. Sparks climbed the black chimney and winked out. Outside, the lane was quiet. The cold left the room by inches. The boy warmed with the work. The smith came down as the fire came ready, a broad, deliberate man who spoke about as often as it snowed in June. He looked at the fire and looked at the boy and gave the small nod that was the whole of his morning speech. The boy nodded back. Then he laid the first rods of iron into the coals, and the day's work began. That iron had come up the road from the coast in a wagon. In flat bars and thin rods, it was dear enough that not an inch of it was wasted. The boy watched the buried rods the way a cook watches a pot. The iron lay still in the coals. Iron does not announce itself. It warms slowly, keeping its counsel, black as ever, and then somewhere in its heart it begins to change its mind. A dull red comes up first, like a winter sunrise. Then the red climbs toward orange, and the orange toward a buttery glow, and the smith would say the iron was coming to a heat. The boy was learning to read those colors the way other boys learned their letters. Too dark, and the iron would not move under the hammer. Too bright, near white, and it would spit sparks and spoil. The proper color for the day's work lived in between, and it could not be written down. It could only be learned by standing at a forge for years with your eyes open. The boy stood. He watched. The smith read it without seeming to look. He would reach in with the tongs at the exact right breath. Every heat, all day. He missed nothing. The boy marked the moment each heat was drawn and pumped and marked again. That was the schooling. There was no other kind on offer and none needed. Most days, the work was nails. The village ate nails the way it ate bread. A new barn wanted thousands of them, house moors, and every nail in the province was made one at a time by somebody's hands at somebody's forge. The smith drew a glowing rod from the fire and laid it across the anvil's face. 4 taps drew the tip to a point, the rod turning a quarter turn between blows. A stroke over the hardy nicked the rod above the point. A twist snapped the nail length free. The piece went point down into the hole of the nail header, and one flat blow spread the top into a head, tidy as a mushroom cap. Then the finished nail dropped, hissing, into the water of the quench trough beside the anvil. The trough answered every nail with the same short hiss, like a cat that never grew used to them. A breath later, the smith's tongs were back in the fire. 6 blows, 8 seconds, 1 nail, all day. The rhythm of it filled the shop, the way a heartbeat fills a body. Taps, hisses, the long sigh of the bellows. It ran so steady that villagers passing in the lane told the hour by it without thinking. The keg filled through the morning. Around the walls stood the bins and shelves of finished work, the shop's plain harvest, a keg of nails, gray and bristling. Door hinges in a stack, strap hinges the length of your forearm, drilled and ready. A row of hooks, small ones for harness, and great ones for the beams of kitchens where the pots would hang. Chain links waiting to be welded shut into chain. Hoe blades for the spring, edged and socketed, leaning in a tools, dreaming of soil. Spring would come for them. Nothing in the shop was for show. Every piece would leave the village lane for a barn or a door or a hearth and be swallowed up into the ordinary work of the town and never be looked at again. The smith seemed entirely at peace with that. He tapped and nicked and headed, unhurried as rain on a pond. The bins emptied and filled again. The boy was not always at peace with it, and this was the small stone he carried in his shoe. He felt slow. His own nails came out of the header, crooked as often as straight, and his count for a morning was a fraction of his master's, and he knew it. Worse than slowness was the wanting. He had seen fine work, real work, as he thought of it then. A door latch in the parson's house with a thumb piece drawn out into a leaf, so thin and sweet you would not believe it had been iron bar. Andirons in a merchant's parlor with heads like acorns, polished to a dull shine. He wanted his hands to make such things. Instead, his hands made nails. And tomorrow they would make nails, and the day after that. Some evenings he sat at the bellows after the fire was banked and felt his whole apprenticeship stretched ahead of him like a road of small gray days. He kept the feeling to himself, or believed he did. Boys believe that. Masters see more than they say. One afternoon, in the quiet between heats, the smith picked a single nail out of the keg and held it up in his black fingers, considering it as though it were a coin. "Look there," he said. The boy looked and saw a nail. "The meeting house roof," the smith said. "Every shingle of it is holding on by these. The parson's fine latch is on a door, and the door hangs from hinges, and the hinges are drawing their strength from nails, driven in before you were born. Every barn in this village, every floor you have ever stood on, every plain plank door between a family and a winter night, all of it is held together by nails that nobody has ever once stopped to admire." He turned the nail over. "Nobody looks at them," he said, "and nothing they hold has ever come apart. That is the trade you are learning. Plain work carries the whole town on its back, and it does not ask to be thanked." Then he dropped the nail back into the keg with a small click and took up his tongs, and that was the end of the longest speech the boy ever heard him make. The shop took it in. The boy went back to the bellows pole, down and back. The fire brightened and dimmed under his hands, and something in his chest had shifted a little, the way a load shifts in a cart and rides easier after. The pole rose and fell. He watched the next heat come up out of the coals, and when his turn came at the header, his nail came out straight. Then a crooked one. Then two straight. It did not matter as much as it had in the morning. You do not learn a trade in a day, any more than you raise a barn with one nail. He was a small part of a plain business that held the world together, and he had begun dimly, in the way of the young, to suspect that this was a thing worth being. The shop worked on around him, taps and hisses, warm at its heart. Outside the light was leaning toward afternoon. The frost on the lane had given up its glitter and gone to mud. Toward the end of the day, the rhythm of the shop wound down slowly, heat by heat, like a fiddler ending a tune. The smith banked the forge fire under its ash for the night. The same gesture as every goodwife at every hearth, the village's dozen fires all tucked in like children. The boy swept the scale and ash from the bricks and stood still a moment at the door, looking down the lane. Smoke rose from every chimney in the village now, straight up into the cold supper fires, everyone. His arms ached in the old familiar places. The keg of nails was fuller than it had been at dawn. That was a day, as days were counted there. It was enough for anyone. His supper would taste of smoke. Across the lane and 2 houses down, a different kind of work was reaching its own steady rhythm. In a farmhouse kitchen, the great kettle had been swung over the fire since morning, and the smell drifting from that doorway was not bread, but tallow, rendered fat, melting for the candle dipping. It came round once, each winter, and it had come round today. The goodwife of that house had rigged her rods and gathered her wicks, and her kitchen was warm and busy, and would stay so until dark. The boy caught the smell of it and knew it at once, the way everyone in the village knew it. Candle dipping day. The village was making its own light for the winter, the same way it made everything else. Patiently, by hand, one dip after another. In a kitchen not far from there, the fire had been kept low, and even since before first light, this was the day the household gave to kindles. The frost had come to stay, and the cold itself was useful now, for tallow sets best in a chilled room. Everything was ready. The kettle steamed on its hook. Picture a woman of middle years at the hearth, sleeves rolled past the elbow, a wooden paddle in her hand. There was, perhaps, such a woman in every house along that lane that week, bent to this same work. The tallow had gone into the great kettle in pale, hard lumps, saved from the autumn butchering and cleaned over many evenings. Now it melted into a clear golden pool above the coals. She skimmed what rose and set it aside for soap. Nothing was thrown away. Nothing ever was. The fat itself had a history before this morning. Weeks earlier it had been trimmed and rendered in this same kettle, strained through a square of linen and poured into crocks to wait. The whole family knew the look of good tallow, firm and pale as candle wax should be. Poor fat made guttering candles. Good fat made steady ones. The difference was worth the labor. Her daughters had spent the evening before on the wicks. They had braided soft cotton into slender cords, cut the cords to length, and tied them along smooth wooden rods. 6 or 8 wicks hung from every rod, spaced a hand apart so the candles would not touch. The rods lay waiting across the backs of 2 chairs pulled out from the table. The wicks hung down like bare winter stems. They did not look like much. The eldest girl lifted the first rod with both hands, the way she had been shown. She carried it to the kettle and lowered it slowly, letting the wicks drink. She lifted it straight up so the new coat would not swing and bend. The first dip hardly seemed to change anything. The wicks came up wet and thin. That was the way of it. The rod went back to the chair backs to cool, and her sister was already at the kettle with the second. Behind her, the third waited, and the fourth a small procession moving between the fire and the cooling place. The work found its rhythm without anyone naming it. Dip, lift, carry, rest. The house kept its own beat. You do not hurry tallow. Dip again too soon, while the last coat is warm, and the new fat melts the old away. The candle comes up thinner than it went in, and the morning's work undoes itself. So the rods rested between turns. The girls learned the length of that rest with their bodies, not with any clock. There was no clock in the house to consult anyway. By the fourth or fifth round, the wicks had begun to thicken and whiten. By the 10th, they were true candles in miniature, slim and tapered, wider at the shoulder than at the foot. A drip fell now and then, and rang softly in the pan set beneath the rods. What fell was saved. It would go back into the kettle. The small children watched from the settle, wrapped together in a wool blanket, forbidden the floor between fire and chairs. Watching was their whole task, and they did it seriously. The youngest counted the dips in a whisper, lost her count, and began again. The cat had claimed the settle's far end. The fire ticked beneath the kettle. Listen to that room for a moment. There was the low murmur of the fire, and under it the small, wet sound of wicks entering tallow. There was the creak of a chair back taking the weight of a rod. There was the grandmother's shears closing and opening with a soft double click. Beneath everything ran the sound of the house itself, timbers easing, wind pressing at the small panes. No single sound asked for attention. Together they made the plain music of a working day, the kind nobody hears until years later, remembering. By mid-morning, the smell of warm tallow had reached every corner of the room. It was a heavy, plain smell close to roasting fat, and it clung to hair and wool alike. You would have known the day from the lane by that smell alone, drifting under the door. In those days, it was simply the smell of the season, the smell of light being made. Nobody remarked on it. It belonged to the day. The mother kept the level in the kettle high, ladling in hot tallow from a smaller pot at the edge. The wicks had to go all the way under at every pass, or the candles would come out, lean at the top. She watched the surface the way a cook watches milk. When the ladle rested, the surface went still and bright. Too hot, and the coat slid off. Too cool, and the fat lumped. She kept it just so. There is a whole grammar of light in a house like that. And tallow was only its plainest word. Rushes pulled from the wet meadow and drawn through fat made rushlights for small errands. A few bayberry candles, green and faintly sweet, were kept back for company and for the best evenings. But tallow did the winter's daily work. Tallow was the workhorse. Even finished candles were spent with a certain thrift. On a common evening, one flame served the whole room set at the table's center, where every task could borrow from it. The family drew their chairs in close around that single point of light. Mending came to the flame, and shelling came to the flame, and the school book came to the flame. The dark parts of the room simply waited their turn. Nobody thought to light 2 candles where one would serve. That was not meanness. It was the plain arithmetic of a farm. Sometime before noon, a neighbor's boy knocked at the door, sent to return a borrowed crock. He stood on the sill and breathed in the smell of the work and grinned because his own house had done its dipping the week before. The mother sent him home with a message about the husking and a heel of bread for the walk. Doors opened for such errands all day in that village. Half the lane's business traveled on the feet of children. The other half traveled over fences, hand to hand. The window light crossed the floor as the morning wore on, a pale square moving over the wide boards. The girls traded places at the kettle when their arms tired. Their aprons took on a soft sheen at the waist, where the rods brushed past. Their hands smelled of fat and woodsmoke. Nobody minded. Hands always smelled of something. Counting the rods near midday, the mother found the thought that came to her every year at this point. All of this would burn. Every candle on every rod existed only to disappear, an inch at a time, through the dark months ahead. The evenings of saving fat, the braiding, the careful cooling, all of it would rise through a flame and be gone. By spring, there would be nothing left to show. The thought was not bitter, but it sat with her. Her own mother sat by the window with shears, squaring the wick ends of the finished candles. The old woman had dipped candles in this room before the chairs now holding the rods were made. She saw the counting and seemed to read the thought behind it. It happens in houses. Thoughts travel without being spoken. Light is meant to be spent, she said, not looking up from the shears. A candle that is never burned has failed at its purpose. You might as well be proud of a loaf nobody eats. She set another candle in the row before her. We are not making candles, child. We are making evenings. The mother let the words settle into the quiet of the room. She had heard the saying every autumn of her life, and it landed the same way each autumn, like a hand laid on the shoulder. The work was not for keeping. It was for spending, the way a day is for spending. She went back to the kettle. The next rod was ready. Slowly, the room filled with finished light. Rod after rod, the candles hung in pale ranks, ivory-colored, faintly glossy, still warm at the core. Late in the work, the mother dipped a few pairs by hand, 2 wicks over her fingers for the odd corners of the house. The eldest girl walked the rows and touched nothing. Counting was allowed, touching was not. When they had hardened overnight, the candles would be cut down in pairs. They would lie in the wooden candle box in the cool of the lean-to, safe from mice. Mice were partial to tallow, and every housewife knew it, and the box had a close lid for that reason. There would be enough for the winter if the house was careful with them. The house was always careful. Care was the whole method. The old woman could have told you how many dipping days she had seen, though she never bothered to count. She had stood at the kettle as a girl in her own mother's kitchen on the far side of the water before ever she crossed to this shore. The work had not changed in her lifetime, not by one motion. The same rods, the same rest, the same patience. She found that steadiness a comfort rather than a burden. Her hands knew the whole of it without her. When she handed the shears to a granddaughter and guided the first cut, something passed between them that had no name and needed none. The room was full of such passings. Every house was. It is not a small thing, making a season's light in a day, but nobody in that kitchen would have called it remarkable, any more than they would have praised the well for holding water. The girls wiped down the rods. The mother banked the coals under the kettle for one last melting. The grandmother trimmed on, gently, at her own pace, the shears whispering. The cat slept. Think of what that room held by early afternoon. 100 small evenings hung there cooling, every one of them a circle of light not yet opened, a page not yet turned. Someone would sew by them. Someone would read the one book in the house by them. Someone would sit up with a feverish child by them, and the flame would keep that watch too. None of that had happened yet. It hung on the rods, waiting, in the shape of plain, pale tallow. You would have found the same sight in the next house and the next. Up and down the lane, kitchens were putting away their light for the cold, each in its own week, each by the same patient method. A village readied itself for winter the way a bird readies a nest, piece by piece. Nothing dramatic anywhere, only provision laid up in pale rows. The quiet of the kitchen deepened as the kettle cooled. Outside, the sun had climbed to its low autumn height, and the last fog had come off the fields. Midday was near, and with it the big meal of the day and the chores that fed it. The mother dried her hands on her apron and looked toward the door. The garden and the well were waiting. They always were. Step out through that kitchen door at midday, and the garden met you before anything else did. It lay on the south side of every house in the village, fenced with split palings against the hens and the neighbor's pig. Close by the door grew the herbs, sage and thyme, and a ragged stand of mint, set there so a cook could reach them in 3 steps. Beyond the herbs ran the beds. The garden was the goodwife's ground, and everyone knew it. Picture her coming down the path with a basket on her hip, her skirts brushing the last of the sage. The frost had ended the tender things weeks before, but the garden was not done for the year. The cabbages sat in their rows like heavy green heads bowed for a blessing. The beans left for seed hung drying on the vine, their pods gone papery and brown, rattling faintly when she touched them. Root crops waited underground for the digging. A garden gives in shifts. It keeps its own calendar. She worked down the cabbage row with a short knife, taking the firmest heads for the cellar. Each one came away with a squeak of cut stalk, and she stripped the loose outer leaves and dropped them in a pile for the pig. The heads went into the basket, dense and cold as stones. Her hands knew the ripe weight without weighing. The knife did its small work. The row grew shorter behind her. In those days, The kitchen garden was not a pleasure ground or a pastime. It was the other pantry, the one that grew. What the field gave in grain, the garden answered in cabbages and onions, in parsnips and turnips and squash, in the herbs that made all of it worth eating. A goodwife read her beds the way her husband read his acres. Both were a kind of literacy. Neither was taught from a book. By the gate stood the well. Under its tall sweep, a young tree trunk balanced on a forked post with a bucket pole hung from the high end. The sweep leaned over the yard like a heron over water. Some houses in the village had a windlass instead, a rolled log and a rope and a crank, but this house kept to the old sweep. It had been raised by the goodwife's father-in-law. It creaked in a voice the whole family knew. She set down her basket and swung the pole out over the stone lip. The oak bucket dropped away into the dark, and she heard it meet the water below. A soft, distant slap. Far down, past the reach of the noon sun, the water lay still and black. She let the bucket drink and tip. Then she hauled, hand over hand, the sweep's great counterweight easing the load. The bucket rose slowly into the light, brimming, spilling silver down the shaft. Cold came off it like a breath. There is a particular cold that lives in well water and nowhere else. It tasted faintly of stone and of the dark it came from, and it numbed the fingers in the carrying. She filled the 2 house pails and hooked them to the wooden yoke across her shoulders. The yoke spread the weight and left a hand free for the gate. Water was wanted a dozen ways before supper, for the pot, for the washing, for the beasts. Somebody walked this path all day. Mostly it was her. Some of the morning's cabbages went down to the cellar that same hour. The cellar was a low, dark room under the house, smelling of earth and apples. She went down the ladder stair. Slowly, a heavy head cradled in each arm. Bins of sand held the carrots. Turnips kept in a barrel. Apples lined the far shelf in rows. Each one turned by hand every week. The cold down there was a friendly cold. It asked for nothing. It simply kept things. A family would eat all winter out of that small, dark room and think nothing of the miracle. She climbed back up to the light. The pails were waiting. She carried the pails in through the lean-to, past the churn and the crocks, and set them on the water bench. The kitchen received her with its wall of warmth and its smell of dinner. The pot had been at the fire since mid-morning, and the boiled squash was going soft and golden in its kettle. She dried her hands and began to lay the board. Dinner at midday was the great meal of the day. Everything before it climbed, and everything after it descended. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the great beam overhead, tied with the same yarn that marked the bean vines. Sage for the sausage, thyme for the pot, mint for a sour stomach, and tansy against the flies of a season now gone by. The goodwife had cut and tied every bunch herself. When she wanted a pinch, she reached up without looking. The beam was her spice shelf. It was her physic garden too, dried and put by. The whole ceiling smelled faintly green. The table, was a broad board on trestles, scrubbed pale as bone. Down its middle she set the wooden trenchers, worn smooth and shallow from years of knives. Pewter spoons came out of the rack, the good ones kept bright with scouring rush. A jug of cider went to the center beside the salt. The brown bread was yesterday's baking, dense with rye and cornmeal, and it cut in heavy, honest slices. Steam rose when the pot came to the table. The room gathered itself. They came in from every direction at the same hour, without being called twice. The men and boys from the field, smelling of cut stalks and oxen. The girls from the kitchen tasks, the small children from wherever small children go. Hats came off at the door. Hands were rinsed at the basin by the lean-to, and the water in it went gray with the morning. The benches scraped in. The household settled around the board like water finding its level. The father bowed his head and said grace, brief and level, the same words as always. Thanks for the food, and for the hands that raised it, and a plain request that both be blessed. Nobody hurried the words, and nobody stretched them. Then the spoons came down, and the meal began. It was not a talkative table. Work sat down to eat, and work does not chatter. You would have heard, mostly, the sounds of the food itself. The knock of spoon on trencher, the cider poured, the bread torn rather than cut, once the loaf got low. The porridge went around first, then the squash, sweet from the pot liquor, then cold pork from the last boiling. The youngest ate, leaning against her mother's arm, half asleep in the warmth. A hound worked the floor under the benches. Nobody acknowledged the hound, and everybody fed him. Tiredness had a good flavor at that table. The morning stood behind them, finished, and the afternoon had not yet begun to ask. For this half hour the whole farm balanced on its point of rest. The father spoke once about the far field, and the eldest son answered, and that was the business of the meal concluded. The cider jug went around again. The quiet held, easy and unbothered, the particular ease of people who will all be needed again shortly. While the others finished, the goodwife looked out the open door to the garden, and the old accounting started up in her without her asking. The weeds she had pulled this week were already sending up cousins. The watering she had done would want doing again, and the hoeing after it, and the same rounds next week, and the week upon that. A garden never stays finished. She had swept this floor 10,000 times and fed this fire past all counting, and the garden was the same story told in green. Every task circled back. Nothing held. It was not a complaint exactly. It was an observation, the kind that visits anyone whose work is made of repetitions. She let it sit beside her through the last of the meal. Then she rose, took her knife, and went out again into the noon light, down the rows to where the seed beans hung. The best plants had been marked all season with a twist of yarn. Not the biggest pods, but the truest, from the vines that bore early and evenly and shrugged off the wet. She shelled the dry pods into her palm, and the seeds rolled out clean and glossy, clicking softly together. Into a small cloth pouch they went, One she had sewn from a worn shirt and marked with thread, so she would know beans from parsnip come spring. She drew the string and weighed the pouch in her hand a moment. It weighed almost nothing. It was next summer, entire, in a bag smaller than a fist. Her daughter had followed her out and stood watching, still chewing a last crust. The goodwife held the pouch out so the girl could feel the seeds shift inside. "Tended soil gives back what it is given," she said, "year upon year, and it does not forget a kindness." That was the whole of the lesson. She said it the way her own mother had said it, in the same doorway of the year. The girl nodded, gravely, the way children nod at things they will understand later. The pouch went into the apron pocket. The apron went back to work. And that was the answer to the accounting, though nobody in that garden would have called it an answer. The rounds of weeding and watering were not a wheel spinning in place. They were a wheel rolling, and it rolled forward into cabbages and cider and seed. And the seed rolled forward into another year. The work came back because the giving came back. You do not resent a circle for being round. She gathered the last of the marked pods without hurry. The pig got the shells. The afternoon began the way afternoons do on a farm, not with a signal, but with a general drift. The men went back toward the field, slower than they had come. The girls cleared the board and scoured the trenchers with sand. The hound found the sun and folded himself into it. The small children were laid down for their nap in the warm corner. The goodwife stood a moment at the well, one hand on the sweep, and drank a dipper of the cold stone-flavored water. The yard was quiet around her. The day had crested and was easing down its far side. Early afternoon in autumn has a stillness all its own, when the light turns the color of cider and the shadows begin to lean. That stillness settled over the garden, over the paling fence and the bowed cabbages and the drying vines. The beds had given what the day asked, and would give again when asked again. That was the arrangement, older than the village itself, soil and hands, asking and giving, round and round, gently, for as many years as anyone tended it. Indoors, the light had shifted too, and it now fell through the western window in a broad, warm band across the floorboards. In that band of light stood the wool wheel, tall and patient, where it had waited all morning. The afternoon belonged to it. The goodwife wiped her hands one last, while on her apron, and went in to meet it. The wheel stood in the band of western light, and the light had come around to meet it, as it did every clear afternoon. It was the great wheel, the wool wheel, tall as the woman who used it, its rim worn satin smooth, where a hand had driven it for years. Beside it sat the basket of rolls, the carded wool waiting in soft white fingers. The goodwife pulled her stool into the warmth. The afternoon's work sat down with her. The wool had already come a distance to reach that window. It had been sheared in spring from the farm's own small flock, washed in the brook, picked clean of burrs by children's fingers on rainy days, Some of it had gone to the carding paddles that very morning. Carding was its own patient chapter. You drew the two paddles across each other, a tuft of fleece caught between their wire teeth, again and again, until every fiber let go of its neighbor and lay one way. Then you rolled the tuft off the paddle into a loose, soft cylinders. The basket filled with them. They weighed nothing at all. Wool in the hand is a pleasure that has not changed since. It carried the faint, sweet smell of the sheep itself, of lanolin and summer pasture, and it warmed the fingers that worked it. The carded rolls were soft past describing, softer than anything else the household owned. A child allowed to carry the basket carried it like eggs. The wire teeth of the paddles left their fine, parallel lines in each tuft, every fiber persuaded, none forced. Good carding made good spinning. Everyone in the room knew that much. The paddles themselves hung on the nail like small honored tools, which is what they were. Picture her standing to the wheel, for the great wheel is worked standing. In her left hand, a roll of carded wool, its end teased out and caught onto the spindle's tip. Her right hand set the rim turning. The spindle blurred, the fibers caught the twist, and she stepped backward, away from the wheel, drawing the roll out as she went. The wool thinned in the air between her fingers and the spindle. It became thread as she walked, 3 steps back, a pause, and forward again to wind on. That was the whole dance. There is a rhythm to the great wheel that no other tool in the house quite had. Step back, and the thread sang out. Step in, and the spindle drank it. The wheel itself gave a soft, continuous whir, low as a dove, rising a note when she drove the rim harder. A woman spinning walked miles in an afternoon without leaving the room. Nobody counted those miles. The thread counted them. The wheel asked for a little tending in return for its work. The drive band, a doubled cord of her own spinning, wanted its tension checked, and the spindle bearing, a twist of greased corn husks, wanted renewing now and again. She knew the wheel's sounds the way a carter knows his axles. A dry note meant grease. A slap meant the band had stretched. She could put either right in less than a minute without sitting down. The wheel had belonged to her mother-in-law, and it would go to a daughter. Furniture moved through families in those days like slow rivers. The wheel was simply passing through her hands, and her hands kept it well for the next pair. Her mother had taught her at this same wheel, and her mother had learned at another in another kitchen, and so on back past anyone's remembering. The stepping, the drawing, the small firm pinch of finger and thumb that governed the twist. In those days, every farmhouse held this knowledge the way it held bread. A girl grew into it without noticing she was learning. Her feet knew the floor before her mind knew the craft. It was inheritance of the truest kind. The spindle filled slowly through the afternoon, the thread building up in a smooth, dense cone. When it would take no more, she slipped the cone off and wound the thread away onto the niddy-noddy. The little wooden frame swung hand to hand that turned loose thread into a tidy skein. The skeins went over a peg by the window. They hung there like pale rope, actual and finished. Thread you could count, thread you could barter if it came to that. Some of the skeins would stay the honest gray-white of the sheep. Others were destined for the dye pot, and the dye pot that season meant butternut. The hulls had been gathered under the trees and steeped in an iron kettle, and they gave a deep, warm brown that held fast through years of washing. Her fingertips were stained with it, a soft tobacco color that soap would not lift. Every woman in the village wore that stain in autumn. It was a kind of signature. Nobody was embarrassed by it. The cat came in while she worked and took up its post by the wheel, watching the thread with one eye open. The little girls sat near the window with their own small tasks, winding quills, picking over a fleece, learning by being in the room. Nobody instructed them. The room instructed them. The wheel whirred, and the light moved, and the house went about its settling afternoon around the sound. You would have found a wheel like this one in nearly every house along that lane, and in the evening, lamplight willing, most of them turning. Cloth did not come from anywhere in those days. It came from here, from this window, from these stained fingers, one drawn-out thread at a time. A shirt began as grass in a sheep's mouth a year before it was a shirt. The thought is worth holding. Nothing in that house was quick, and nothing in that house was anonymous. Under the window sat the proof of it, folded on the chest, the winter blanket, half born. Through the cold months, a fleece was slowly becoming that blanket. Sheared, washed, carded, spun, dyed, and at last woven up the road where the loom stood. It advanced a little every week. Nobody hurried it. A season made it, the way a season makes anything worth keeping. By spring, it would lie heavy on a bed. It would outlast everyone's impatience. And then, mid-draw, the thread broke. It always did, now and then, and it did now. The end whipped back toward the spindle, and her stepping rhythm lost its floor, and the wheel spun on a moment with nothing to feed it. A thin place had given way, some spot where the fibers had drawn out faster than the twist could bind them. She stopped. The whir ran down. The room held its small silence. If there was an unease in her, it lived in that silence. Not anger, nothing so warm. Just the old flicker of doubt that visits any maker. The sense that all work is thin somewhere, that every thread of a whole winter's spinning has its weak inches, that what she made might not hold. A broken thread is a small thing, but it breaks mid-step, mid-breath, and for a moment the whole afternoon seems to hang on it. The cat opened its other eye. The light went on moving. What she did next, she did without thinking, because her hands had done it 10,000 times. She caught the two broken ends and laid them together, overlapping, and gave them a twist between finger and thumb, gently, feeding them back to the turning spindle. The wheel took up the mend as if nothing had happened. The twist bound the join, and the join drew out, and the thread ran on past it. She was stepping backward again within a breath. The song resumed on the same note. Here is the truth she knew in her hands, whether or not she ever said it aloud. The finished cloth would hold. It does not show where it broke. A join, well-made vanishes into the web, carried by all the sound thread around it, and the blanket keeps a bed warm for 2 generations, with 1,000 mended places in it, everyone invisible. Wool wants to hold together. That is its nature. The spinner only asks it to remember. So the afternoon went on, unbothered, thread by thread. Break and mend were simply part of the spinning, the way a stumble is part of a road. She did not count the joins. Nobody counting sleep counts the turnings over. The spindle filled again, and the second skein went to the peg, and the stain on her fingers deepened by a shade. The wheel whirred. The house drowsed around it. When the light through the window went soft and level, too dim for the thread's fine judgments, she let the wheel run down and did not drive it again. The rim turned a last lazy circle and went still. She sat, then, for the first hour of sitting since morning, and took up the knitting from the basket by her stool. Needles ask less of the eyes than thread asks. A gray stocking grew in her lap by feel alone. Her hands worked on. The rest of her began, at last, to settle. Every foot in that house walked on her knitting. Stockings for her husband, thick to the knee for winter field work. Stockings for the boys, forever worn through at the heel and forever mended. Small ones for the small children, on needles fine as straws. She turned a heel the way other people hum, absently, perfectly, her mind free to wander the whole farm while her fingers counted. Mittens came off those needles too, and mufflers and caps for the babies of half the village. Wool went out of that room in every direction. It came back as gratitude and as favors owed, and sometimes just as the sight of a neighbor's child warm in the meeting house. That was wealth, of the kind that place understood. The little girls wound the day's skeins into balls, softly quarreling over whose wound rounder. The cat moved to the warm stones by the fire and folded its paws under its chest. Supper would be a small meal, bread and milk, and what the noon left behind. For that was the way of evenings then. The big work of the day stood done and visible. The candles cooling in their ranks, the cellar heavier by a basket, the pegs holding new thread. A day you could touch. Few of us can say the same of our days. There is a deep comfort just in picturing it. She knit on while the window grayed. In her lap, the stocking. In the corner, the wheel. On the chest, the half-made blanket. Each one a different age of the same wool. The room smelled of tallow and butternut and the day's bread. The fire kept its counsel. The quiet grew roots. Outside, the village was drawing its own threads in for the night. Cattle toward barns, children toward doors, smoke rising straighter as the wind lay down. Down the lane, past the last fence, the stream ran on in the failing light, and it had work of its own that never rested. You could hear it faintly from the doorstep, and under it, lower still, a wet wooden rumble, patient as breathing. The grist mill was turning. The stream was carrying the day toward it. We can follow the sound down the lane in a moment, in the quiet. Down along the stream, where the meadow narrowed and the alders leaned close over the water. The village kept its mill. You would have heard the wheel from here, a soft and steady sound, like rain that had learned patience. It never hurried. The wheel turned slowly. The stream came down from the upland ponds and slid over the low dam in one smooth sheet, dark as bottle glass. Above the dam, the mill pond lay still, holding the last of the afternoon light on its face. The water waited there. Whatever slid over the dam went straight to work below it. And whatever waited would work tomorrow. The mill itself was a plain building, oak frame, and pine boards set on a footing of fieldstone. Spray had darkened the lower boards to the color of wet slate, and moss grew fat in the seams. Inside, everything wore gold. Meal dusted the beams, the ledges, the window sills, fine as pollen and pale as candlelight. It softened every edge. Even the cobwebs in the high corners hung heavy with flour, little pale hammocks that swayed whenever the building trembled. The building always trembled. It shook faintly and evenly, the way a sleeping animal breathes, because the wheel was turning outside and the stones were at work within. The mill had its own weather and its own smell. Wet stone and cut, grain, tallow and old oak, river mud and warm meal. All of it folded into one air, and a blindfolded man would have known that air anywhere in the county. Farmers carried the smell home in their coats. Their wives knew where they had idled half the afternoon. They did not begrudge it much, for the mill was where the news was. It was the slowest news anywhere. Who had a calf? Whose orchard was bearing? Whose son was courting? Whose daughter over the ridge? None of it hurried anyone. There was, perhaps, a miller in that village. He was a broad and quiet man, meal in his eyebrows, meal in the creases of his hands. By late afternoon, he had been grinding since the dew burned off the grass. His sleeves were flowered white, his hat was flowered, his boots left pale prints. He moved through the mill the way a man moves through his own house in the dark. He never reached for anything without finding it. When a farmer came up the lane with corn, the miller met him at the door. He took the sack in his arms, weighed it with one small lift, and set it in the line along the wall. Each sack waited its turn. That was the oldest rule of the mill. It was older than the miller himself, older than his father, who had kept the place before him. First come, first ground. The deacon's corn stood behind the widow's corn if the widow had come first, and nobody thought to question it. The sacks leaned together along the wall like men dozing on a bench. Each was tied with its own kind of string, and each was known. The miller could tell a farm by the tie of its sack. He could tell it by the smell of the corn. Some had dried in a warm loft, some was sweeter, some was dusty from a lean field on the hill. The heart of the mill sat at its middle, 2 round stones, one riding above the other. A traveling stone dresser cut their furrows fresh each year and left them keen. The lower stone never moved. The upper stone turned slowly with the wheel outside, near enough to kiss the lower, never once touching it. Corn trickled from the hopper into a little wooden shoe. A chattering piece called the damsel shook the shoe with every turn. The kernels walked their own way down into the eye of the stone. Between the two faces, the grain was drawn outward, furrow by furrow. It came out at the rim as meal, and the meal came out warm. It slid down a chute into the trough below, soft as sifted snow. Not everything that came to the stones was corn for the table. There was provender to crack for the beasts, and rye for the dark loaves, and malt to break for the household brewing. Each kind asked its own gap between the stones and its own pace of pouring. The miller shifted from one to the next without ceremony, the way a cook moves from pot to pot. Rye smelled of straw and shadow. Malt smelled sweet, like wet hay. Corn smelled of the sun. He had ground them all for so many years that his nose kept the accounts before his eyes did. It told him what was in the hopper from the foot of the stairs. The miller put his hand under the chute and let the meal fill it. He rubbed a pinch between finger and thumb, feeling for the fineness. When it ran coarse, he eased the upper stone down by the weight of a thought. When it ran too fine, he lifted it the breadth of a hair. Nobody taught this on paper. It lived in the hand, passed palm to palm down the generations like the warmth of a handshake. His father's hand had known it. His own hand knew it now. Below the floor, in the dim of the wheel pit, the great wooden gears met tooth by tooth. The teeth were applewood, set in oak rims, worn smooth as spoon handles, and dressed with tallow so they murmured instead of knocked. Wheel turned, shaft rolled, stones ground. Nothing in that chain hurried, and nothing in it rested. It is not a loud trade, milling, whatever people say of it. It is a low one. The sound sat under the village afternoon the way a drone sits under a psalm tune. Folk half a mile off stopped hearing it at all. They only noticed it on days the gate was shut, when the world went strangely bare. For his pay, the miller took no coin. He took a toll of the meal itself, a fixed measure from every bushel. It was scooped in a worn wooden dish that hung on its peg beside the stones. Everyone knew the dish. Everyone had watched it scraped level with a straight stick, and everyone was content, mostly in the manner of neighbors. The toll meal went into the miller's own bin, and the bin fed his household. What was over he traded for cheese, for cider, for shoe leather. A mill fed its miller sideways, a little from every farm. In return, he belonged to all of them, the way the road did, and the spring. On the doorpost, at shoulder height, the miller kept his reckoning in chalk, a stroke for each bushel, a crop for each foot-court toll rubbed out at the month's end when all was square. There is a kind of bookkeeping that needs no book, and this was it. Few men in the village read print with any ease. Every one of them could read that doorpost. Open accounts stay honest. So the strokes stood there in the open, white on brown oak, plain as weather. Above the dam, the pond kept its own small commonwealth. Eels lay in the mud by the sluice, and herons walked the far shallows on careful stilts. Boys fished there on summer evenings with alder poles and string. The swallows worked low. In dry weeks, the pond hoarded water for the wheel, and the miller watched its level the way other men watched the sky. The pond was the mill's patience, saved up in one smooth sheet. A full pond was a full larder. Every farmer who crossed the dam glanced at it without thinking, the way a man glances at his own woodpile. Late in the day, the light came low through the western window. It stood in the flour dust, like a bar of solid amber. The wheel ran on. The miller tipped the hill farm's sack into the hopper and went to the door to breathe. The pond had gone the color of pewter. Below him, the wheel lifted its buckets full and set them down, empty, dark boards shining, water sliding off in bright strings, and there, on his own doorsill, a small old feeling found him. It came sometimes at that hour. The wheel turned whether he watched it or not. It had turned while he ate, while he slept, while he was a boy who had never lifted a sack. The stream had never once asked his leave. Beside that patient water and those unhurried stones, a man could feel light as chaff. He did not brood on it. It was more shiver than thought, and he let it pass through him as the water passed through the wheel. The last farmer of the day was an old man from beyond the orchard, come with a half sack and no hurry at all. His ox stood in the lane, switching flies, patient as furniture. The old man set his stick by the door and stood with the miller while the stones finished the hill corn. Then his own corn went whispering down the hopper. The stones sang low. The two of them watched the meal begin to fall. It fell warm. He put his hand under the chute, the way every man did, and let it fill his palm. "My grandfather brought corn to this water," the old man said. "The dam was new then, and the stones were rough as a plowed field. The stream was turning wheels before either of us was weaned. It will turn them when our grandchildren are gray." The miller owned that the wheel sometimes made him feel small. He said it lightly, as men say such things. The old farmer nodded and rubbed the meal between his fingers. "You do not turn the wheel," he said. "No man ever turned it. The stream turns the wheel, and the miller tends it. Tending is a full day's work, and an honest one. The water was here first, and it will be here last," he said. "It grinds no corn without you." And he shook the meal from his palm. The meal went on falling. Then his sack was filled and tied, and the toll was scraped level in the dish. Neither man counted it close, because neither man ever had. The farmer shouldered his half sack, took up his stick, and woke the ox with a word. Cart and man went up the lane through the first of the dusk, pale meal prints fading behind them. The miller raised a floury hand. The lane stood empty then. The miller stayed to put the mill to bed. He let the hopper run empty and heard the stones go light. He shut the sluice gate, and the trough drained, and the wheel came round once more and hung dripping. The building's faint trembling ended. The quiet afterward had a furred and flowery softness. He swept the trough with a goose wing, covered the bins, and hung the toll dish on its peg. Then he stood still in the doorway. The pond lay smooth above the dam, saving the night's water for the morning's work. Tomorrow there would be sacks by the door again. The damsel would chatter, and warm meal would fall, and the dish would be scraped level. The round would go on, because it was a round. A circle has no end. He latched the door and heard the latch drop home. The stream went on without him, as it always had, and he found he did not mind. Tending was his part. The tending was done. Below the dam, the water gathered itself and slid away east through the alders, easier and wider as it went. It ran past the tan yard and the lower meadows and out of the sound of the village altogether. Downstream, the river widened towards salt water and a small harbor, where the light was going and the boats were coming home. Downstream, the river forgot it had ever been a mill stream. It widened between salt meadows, took on the smell of the sea, and slid at last into a small harbor behind a wooded point. The light was going when it arrived. So was the tide. You would have smelled the place before you saw it. Tar and salt, and wet planking fish, and weed, and old rope. A working smell, and under it, the cold, clean breath of open water. The breath came and went. Even the air out there kept a rhythm. The harbor was small, as harbors go, a stone wharf, a wooden pier on piles, a huddle of sheds with cedar shingles gone silver. Lay their moorings inside the point. The tide had gone slack around them. Slack water is the sea's one idle hour. The harbor lay still under the last light. Nothing pulled and nothing pushed. The boats rode their own reflections. Out over the bar, a line of stakes marked the channel, each with its tuft of brush. Men who knew the sands had set them there, the way farmers set fence posts. The marks led home. Every boat that used them knew it. Boys fished from the pier while the light lasted, hand lines down among the piles. They caught small striped fish and threw most of them back. A heron stood out on the flats, folded up like a pocket knife, waiting on its own supper. The mud at low water had a rich, dark smell, weed and clams and old ships. It was not a pretty smell, and no one who loved the place would have changed it. Boats had been built on that shore and mended on it. The whole cove smelled of work. The last of the fishing boats were coming in around the point, sails slack, men easy at the tillers. One by one they came up the marks and picked up their moorings. Sails came down and were furled and lashed along the booms in neat gray rolls. Oars were shipped. Ropes were coiled down flat on the wharf in tidy mats. Sailors coil them so, from habit, so that no foot finds a loop to catch. A lantern went up a masthead, hand over hand, and hung there like a patient star. The hulls nudged their moorings, wood against rope, and settled. An old harbor master walked the wharf at that hour every evening of his life. He had been to sea in his day, and the sea was in his walk. He went slowly down the planking, hands behind his back, nodding to each crew as they came ashore. He knew every hull by its lines and every man by his gait. He knew whose mooring chafed and whose pump wheezed. He carried no list, and needed none. The wharf knew his tread. In a shed by the pier head he kept a slate. Each evening he chalked the boats on it as they came in. It was the same chalkwork the miller kept on his doorpost, only here it smelled of salt. A coasting sloop lay against the wharf itself, half laden for the city market. Her hold smelled of new barrel staves and old molasses. Shingles went aboard in bundles, corn in sacks, firkins of butter from the upland farms. Her master meant to go out on the morning tide. He and the harbor master stood over the open hatch, talking freight in low voices, the words half swallowed by the hold. It was talk with no hurry in it. The tide would decide the morning. Tides make patient men. Along the pier, the fishermen sat folding and mending nets while the light held. Wooden needles went in and out, knot by knot. Torn places closed under their hands like water healing over. The nets smelled of deep water. The men talked as men talk over familiar work, low and unhurried, half the words worn smooth. Behind them, on the shore, stood the fish flakes, low racks where the split cod lay drying, silver as the shingles above them. The day's catch had been salted down already. Gulls walked the tide line with their shoulders hunched, complaining softly, settling toward sleep. At the end of the pier, an old fisherman sat splicing an eye into a mooring line. He worked the strands over and under with a wooden fid, unhurried as a man buttering bread. A tub of trawl line sat beside him, hooks baited and coiled for morning. Torn sailcloth lay folded for patching. His pipe had gone out and he had not noticed. Work like that carries its own evening inside it. The hands go on while the day puts itself away. From the houses above the landing came the first smells of supper. Fish chowder, mostly, and bread and wood smoke drifting down over the water to mix with the tar. A man mending a net would lift his nose and judge his own chimney among the others. Hunger keeps an honest clock. The light thickened from gray to violet. The water went the color of pewter, then the color of slate. The gulls stopped arguing. Out on the Narrows, the ferryman was poling his last crossing. A farm wife rode with her basket, and a boy sat in the bow with a dog. The flat scow slid over its own image. The water barely folded. The pole rose, swung forward, and found the bottom again, easy as breathing. He had made the crossing more times than any man could count, and the river knew the touch of his pole. On the far side, the wife stepped off with her basket, and the dog went first, as dogs do. The ferryman leaned on his pole and let the scow rest. His whole day was one crossing wide, laid end to end, over and over. Now it was done. His house stood at the landing, and a candle already burned in its window. The ferry would cross at first light for anyone who hailed it. It had crossed for grandmothers and peddlers, for brides and calves and letters. The river was a road, and he was its gate, and gates keep short hours in the dark. He poled the scow home through the last of the color on the water. The Narrows went smooth behind him. The dog on the far bank barked once at nothing and gave it up. There was, perhaps, a young deckhand on the last boat in, a boy in his first season, all wrists and sunburn. He had come down from a hill farm in the spring, the way younger sons did. The water had taken him on without asking much about him. His hands were new to the work and raw from it. It fell to him to coil down the lines and make the deck fair for the night. He did it with care, because care had been asked of him. The halyards were made fast. The coils lay flat and even. The little deck came out as neat as a swept kitchen. He was slow about it, and nobody hurried him. Neatness on a boat is a kind of rest. Everything fast, everything found, everything ready for first light. But between one coil and the next, he straightened his back and looked past the point. Out there, the water went on to the edge of the sky, and then it went on past that. He knew the names of the far places only from other men's mouths. The sea did not end anywhere a boy could think to. Against all that gray reach, the town behind him looked like a handful of lit windows spilled at the water's edge. It looked small enough to pocket. He stood still with the line in his hands. The bigness out there pressed on him the way night presses on a candle flame. It did not frighten him quite. It only made him feel his size. The old harbormaster came down the wharf on his round and stopped near the boy's bollard. He followed the boy's lookout past the point. Nothing he saw there troubled him. Then he turned his back on the open water, easy as a man turning from a window, and began to count the boats. He counted under his breath, hull by hull, the way a shepherd counts sheep through a gate, all in, all fast, all riding easy. "You do not measure a harbor from the seaside," he said. "You measure it from the shore. It does not matter how wide the water is. A harbor is the size of the boats it keeps. Count them for yourself," the old man said. The boy counted silently and found the count complete. Every boat that had gone out that morning lay at its mooring now. Every evening, in every port in the world, the boats come in, the old man said. They came in for my grandfather. They will come in for your grandsons. The sea is big because it has all the harbors to hold, said the old man. He tapped the bollard once, the way a man pats a fence post. Then he went on down the wharf. For more years than the boy had been alive, the old man had made that count. He had made it in fog and in frost, at high water and at low. The count had a shape, like a psalm said nightly, and the shape held him as much as he held it. Harbors keep their keepers. That is the bargain, and both sides keep it. Something in the boy's chest came down like a sail handed in fair weather. He bent to his coil again and finished it, flat and fair. There is a kind of counting that puts the counter to rest, and he had learned it between two coils of rope. He shouldered his bag and went up the pier with the last of the crew. He looked back once from the head of the lane. The lantern at the masthead burned small and sure over the anchorage. He would look for it tomorrow from the water. It would be there. Lanterns were lit in the sheds, candle lanterns with panes of script horn, and the pier took on a low amber glow. Doors were pinned shut, one after another. Nets were folded over the rails. The last dory was hauled up the shingle and turned keel up like a sleeping turtle. One by one, the men went up from the water toward their suppers, boots loud on the planking, voices dropping as they went. Smoke stood straight up from the chimneys of the lower town. Somewhere a door closed on its latch. The gulls had gone quiet on the ridgepoles. Night came up out of the water rather than down from the sky. The moored boats went from shapes to shadows, and then to soft knockings in the dark. A block tapped a mast somewhere, slow as a drip. You could have walked the wharf blind and known it all by sound. Water against piles, rope against wood, the tide leaving without a fuss. The tide, having rested, began to slide slowly back out through the narrows, taking its smell of weed along with it. The moored hulls swung round together to face it, obedient as weather vanes. Hull nudged mooring, rope creaked soft. The masthead lantern kept its small watch. The quiet along the water was a working one, wound ready for morning. All in, all fast, the harbor held what it kept. Behind the sheds, the lane turned up the hill, worn smooth by sea boots. The men climbed it in twos and threes, talking of tomorrow's weather in tonight's easy voices. Above the roofs, the post road climbed away from the water between stone walls. Partway up, an ordinary kept its fire in for travelers, and its windows made the warmest light on the road. The harbor settled at its moorings behind them. The night had room for everyone. Up from the water, the post road climbed between stone walls. Partway up the hill, a house kept its light on the road. A sign hung over the door on an iron bracket, swinging small in the night air, its paint worn soft by weather. In those days, such a house was called an ordinary. The names said what it meant. Ordinary comforts at ordinary prices, set at the road's edge for whoever the road brought. Supper, fire, and a bed. There is a kind of house that belongs to no one and to everyone, and this was one. The windows were small and deep. The firelight in them reached across the ruts like a hand. Travelers came in at dusk, singly and in pairs, the day's riding stiff in their backs. A drover came first, then 2 chapmen with their packs, then a rider alone. The hostler took the horses at the stable door and spoke to each horse before he spoke to any man. Each one was rubbed down with a twist of hay until its coat lay flat. Each was watered when it had cooled and given its measure of oats. The stable filled with the sound of grinding and the sweet smell of hay. A horse at its manger is a settled thing. Saddlebags were carried in. Boots were scraped at the step. The innkeeper met each man at the door and took his measure kindly. Supper was one fixed price. A bed was another. Hay for a horse a third. He chalked each man's reckoning on a slate beside the door. It was the same patient chalk the miller used, and the harbor master after him, though none of the 3 ever thought to compare. The drover's dog was let in on its best manners. It went under the bench at once, an old hand at inns. Its nose stayed with the kettle. The door opened on firelight and closed on the dark behind each man. Inside, the room was low and brown and warm. The beams hung close overhead, strung with dried herbs and a ham in a linen bag. The fire had burned since morning and had settled into a deep bed of coals. A kettle of stew hung over it from the crane, salt, pork and beans and onions, thickened with meal. It had been there most of the day. Stew is patient food. Brown bread waited under a cloth. The tables were set with wooden trenchers and pewter mugs, spoons and knives at every place. Nobody missed a fork. Forks were rare things on the road in those days, and nobody's supper suffered for it. The chapmen had walked from the last town with their packs on poles, needles and thread, ribbon and buttons, printed ballads and bucklegusts, a whole shop folded into oilcloth. They would open the packs in the morning if anyone asked. Tonight, the packs stood in the corner like two patient guests. The drover had left his cattle penned at the edge of the village. He would walk them down to the coast market over the days ahead. He talked of grass and water the way sailors talk of wind. Every trade has its weather. The innkeeper's wife went around the room, lighting the tallow candles. She lit each new wick from the flame of the one before, fire handed to fire, the way news is handed house to house. Candle by candle, the room came up out of the dark. Tallow smoke has a warm animal smell, and it folded in with the stew and the wood smoke. She set the candles where they served best, one to a table, two by the settle. Light was not spent freely in those days. It was poured like cider, enough and no more, gold below, shadow above. Picture for a moment one traveler among them. A saddler's man, say, riding home from the city trade, 3 days out, with 2 days yet to go. He had been in the saddle since first light, and his cloak was heavy with road dust. He hung the cloak on a peg near the fire and took his place on the bench at the common table. He warmed his hands first, then he ate. The stew went down slowly, spoonful by spoonful, and the brown bread wiped the bowl shining. He was hungrier than he had known. Supper on the road tells a man the truth about his day. The innkeeper drew cider from the barrel in the back room. For any man who wanted it warm, he took the flip iron from the coals. The loggerhead lived there, black and patient, for that purpose alone. He plunged it hissing into the mug. The mug sang for a moment. The cider foamed up and went sweet and bitter and smoky, all three at once. Men held such a mug in both hands. It warms the palms before it warms anything else. That, too, was part of the recipe. The innkeeper's children fetched and carried, quick and solemn with the importance of it. A boy brought in wood by the armload and stacked it fair. A girl set down the butter and out got a ribbon end from a chapman for her trouble. The family would eat afterward in the kitchen from the same kettle. An ordinary fed its keepers last. Nobody minded that either. The talk at the table was kept low, the way talk goes in candlelight. Roads and weather, the price of leather in the city, the price of corn in the towns, which ford ran shallow, and where the new causeway held. It was quiet talk, meant for the table, and, no farther, nobody performed. Stories were told with their edges worn round from telling. A laugh came now and then, low, with the fire ticking under it. Strangers at the same table passed the salt and learned one another's trades. That was introduction enough. An ordinary was a kind of slow post in those days. A letter left on the mantel would travel north with the next rider going north. A parcel might wait there a fortnight and arrive all the same. Men trusted the road with their words, and the road mostly deserved it. News moved at the pace of horses and mended boots. Nobody expected faster, so nobody missed it. And somewhere in that warm room, the saddler's man felt the evening lean on him. He was 2 days from his own door. His own hearth was lit tonight, and hands not his were latching his own shutters. Between this bench and his bench at home lay the width of 2 counties, hill after dark hill. It is not grief, that feeling. It is smaller and quieter, more like a draft under a door. You feel the distance the way you feel a stone in a shoe, at every step and never badly. He turned his mug and looked into the fire. The fire did not explain anything. Fires never do. The innkeeper came around with the jug and read the man's face, the way innkeepers learn to do. He filled the mug without being asked. Counting the miles, he said, and it was not a question. Every man at this table sits some distance from his own fire. That is the whole trade of a house like this. Every road in the world keeps such houses set a day's ride apart, like knots in a rope. The fire here is kept for whoever comes, known or unknown. You do not carry your hearth with you on the road, so you borrow one at dark, and some other night a stranger borrows yours. Your own fire is tended tonight, he said. You are sitting at a tended fire now. Between the 2 of them, the road is only a road. And he moved on down the table with the jug. The man drank. The saddler's man turned the words over the way you turn a coin to see both sides. Houses like this one strung along every road in the world, a fire waiting at each. His own hearth tended, this hearth lent. The distance between them did not shrink. It only stopped mattering so much. He finished his cider slowly and let the warmth sit in his chest. Somebody's dog settled under the bench with a sigh. The fire ticked. The kettle breathed. Bedtime came early, as it does where candles cost real money. The wife lit small chamber candles at the mantel, one for each man going up. Each traveler carried his own little flame up the steep stair, and the stair creaked in its known places. The beds upstairs were few and shared. Nobody minded much. Strangers lay feet to head under one blanket, and nobody thought it strange, for that was the custom of the road. A man kept his coat for a pillow and set his boots where his feet would find them. The bed cords creaked once or twice under each newcomer and were done. Below, the innkeeper sat a last pipe with the drover, boots to the warm stones. They spoke of hay and the price of oxen, and then of nothing, comfortably. A pipe at the end of the day burns itself down to a nod. He knocked the ash into the coals and pinned the door for the night. The house was shut like a well-made chest. The chamber under the roof held 3 beds and a rush-bottomed chair. The ceiling came down on both sides, so a tall man learned to stoop by his second visit. Moonlight lay on the floor in a pale strip and climbed the wall as the night went on. The drover was asleep before his candle smoke had cleared. One of the chapmen murmured over his accounts, even in his sleep, adding and carrying to the end. Sleep in a shared chamber has its own manners. You keep to your edge, you lend your warmth. By full dark, the breathing upstairs had found one rhythm, the way rowers fall into one stroke. Nobody planned that. Nobody ever does. The saddler's man lay under the eaves and listened to the house. He lay still and let the day drain out of him. Floorboards ticked as they cooled. The sign swung on its bracket outside, a soft creak out, a soft creak home. His horse stood dry and fed not 30 paces from where he lay. His own hearth burned 2 days east, and it was tended, and he knew it. The distance was the same as it had been at supper. It weighed less now. The innkeeper's wife banked the fire last of all. She raked the coals together and covered them over with ash, so that morning would find seed of fire alive. Under the gray, fire was kept in those days more than it was made. Flint and steel were a chore for cold fingers, and a live coal was a small fortune at daybreak. She snuffed the candles one by one, and the room went back into the dark it had come out of. The house went quiet above her, bed by bed. Then the kitchen was still. She stood a breath at the foot of the stair, listening to the whole of it, and was satisfied. She carried the last candle up. The ordinary held its people the way the harbor held its boats, each one in a berth, each one rid of the day. The sign swung small over the empty step. The fire slept under its ash, and the house slept over its fire. Out in the village street, a lantern came around the corner of the meeting house, moving at a walker's easy pace. The watchman was beginning his round. Out in the village street, the last of the evening light had thinned away to almost nothing. One window burned low behind a shutter. The rest had gone dark. The watchman came out of his door with his coat buttoned to the chin, and he paused on the step to let his eyes learn the darkness. There was frost in the air, faint and clean, and the smell of woodsmoke lay over the lane like a second sky. He knew that smell well. He knew every smell this village made in every season, and he could read the night by his nose almost as surely as by his lantern. He carried a staff of ash wood taller than his shoulder, worn pale where his hand had gripped it through the years. It is not a weapon, and it never was one. It served as a third leg on the icy ruts, a knocker for loose gates, a companion of sorts. In his other hand swung a candle lantern, a small tin house pierced with holes, its panes of scraped horn gone amber with age. Inside it, a tallow candle burned with a patient flame. The flame leaned when he walked. It always leaned. The light it gave was modest, a soft ring on the ground before his boots. That was all the light the work required. Before leaving, he had covered his own fire, the way every household in the village covered theirs. You would have seen him kneel at the hearth with the iron rake in his fist. He drew the red coals together into a low mound at the back of the firebox, unhurried, patient as a man tucking in a child. Then he capped the mound with ash, one careful shovelful after another, until no ember showed and only a fine breath of warmth rose through the gray. Under that cap the fire would keep till morning, sleeping as the house slept, tame and safe. In those days, a fire was never truly out. It was only put to bed. Now he walked. His round began at the meeting house and went down the main lane, past the well, past the smithy, where the banked forge breathed faintly through its great chimney. His boots knew the ruts by heart. His staff found the frozen puddles before his feet did. Every little while he stopped, lifted his chin, and called the hour in a low voice, hardly louder than a man speaking across a supper table. 10 of the clock, he would say, and all is well. Then he listened to the lane. Then he walked on. You do not call the hour to wake anyone. The old men had taught him that in his first winter of the work. The call was made soft on purpose, pitched to slip beneath sleep. Rather than cut through it, a sound the sleeping ear could note and then let go. A village hears its watchman the way a sleeper hears rain on the roof. It asks nothing of him. It only tells him the world is being minded. At each house he made his small inspections, the same ones his hands had made 1,000 nights before. He pressed a palm flat against the shutters to feel that they were fast in their frames. He tried the latch of the cooper's gate, which had a habit of lifting in a west wind. Where a shutter hung loose, he set it right and slid the bar home, making no more noise than the wind itself would have made. The wood was cold under his fingers. The iron was colder. He worked by feel. The lantern hanging from the crook of his arm, its little flame steady inside the horn. At the widow's house, he lingered a moment more, as he did every night, because her chimney was old and her hands were stiff. He stepped back into the middle of the lane and read the smoke against the stars. There is a way of reading a chimney, and he had learned it young. A banked fire breathes thin, a gray thread that rises straight and unhurried and means the ash cap holds. A ragged smoke, thick and rolling, means a fire left open to the night, spending its wood for no one. Tonight, the widow's thread rose thin and true. So did the miller's. So did the smith's. Chimney by chimney, the village told him it had put itself to bed properly, and he believed it. Smoke does not know how to lie. Behind him, as he went, the last wakeful windows darkened one by one. The tailor's lamp went first, a small gold square swallowed whole. Then the glow above the inn door faded, and the innkeeper's bolt went home with a soft double knock of iron. A dog stirred somewhere behind the wheelwright's fence, thought better of it, and settled. Down toward the water, he could hear the tide working among the pilings, patient and regular, a sound with no edges. The quiet gathered in, behind his footsteps, like water closing behind a boat. He knew what lay behind each door, near enough. Barrels of cider in the cellars, apples in the loft, laid out not touching, wool on the wheel half spun, salt fish in the pantry, bread in the dough trough, seeds in their pouches by the chimney. A village at night is a storehouse of finished days. He walked past all of it like a man walking past his own barn. None of it needed him. All of it, in a manner, was his to mind. The thought pleased him. It pleased him every night. By the well he stopped and set his lantern on the coping. The bucket hung motionless on its rope. The surface of the water far below held one pale star without a tremble. The whole village grown that calm. He allowed himself a swallow of cider from the flask in his coat, cold and sharp with the season. Then he moved on past the green, past the schoolhouse, out along the lane where the houses thinned and the fields began. Marking the far corner of his round the way, a farmer marks the last furrow. The frost had stiffened the grass. It creaked faintly underfoot. Nothing else moved at all. And it was there, at the far turn, that the old thought found him, the one that visited most nights and always by the same gate. He called the hour, and no one heard it. He named the state of the village, and the village slept through the naming. Every soul behind those shutters was gone away into sleep. Husbands and wives and children and hired men, and he alone stood out under the cold, with his breath showing. His voice went down the empty lane, and nothing answered it. Not a latch, not a footstep. A man could feel himself the only creature left awake in the world. The thought was not fear, exactly. It was more like standing on the shore of something very wide. But he had an answer for that thought, and it was an old man's answer, given to him years ago on this very corner. The watchman before him had walked this round for most of a lifetime, a slow, careful man with a white beard and a lantern he never let anyone else carry. On the young man's first night, he had confessed it aloud, there at the turn. "Nobody hears me," he had said. "I might as well say nothing." The old man had stopped walking. He had set down his lantern on the frozen road, deliberate as a mason setting a stone, and looked at him for a while under the stars. "A town that sleeps through your call," he said at last, "is a town that trusts it. They heard you before they ever slept, son. They hear you, the way they hear the tide." And then, taking up the lantern again, he had added the thing that stayed. Silence is the sound of the work succeeding. If ever they wake to your voice, that is the night something has gone wrong. Pray for the nights when nobody stirs. He had walked beside the old man, the rest of that round without speaking, turning it over. He turned it over, yet most nights, the way a thumb turns a worn coin. The old watchman was years gone now to his rest, and the staff in his own hand had been that man's staff, passed on with the round itself, smooth in the same places. Every night the round was walked the same way, gate by gate, chimney by chimney. The work never asked to be seen, to be done well. The sleeping village was not his solitude. It was his work, lying finished all around him in the dark. Every darkened window, a task completed, every thin thread of smoke, a small perfection. So he came back up the lane the way he had come, slowly now, in no hurry to be done. He gave the hour once more by the meeting house, softer than before, mostly for himself and the frost. All is well, he told the shuttered street, and the street, by its silence, agreed with him. He checked the widow's smoke, one last look, still thin, still true. His own house waited at the end of the row, with its banked hearth warm under the ash, keeping his return the way it kept the morning's fire. You would have heard his call from here. If you had been lying awake behind one of those shutters, and it would have asked nothing of you. It would only have passed beneath your sleep like a cart on a far road, telling you the shutters were fast, and the smoke ran thin, and the night had a keeper. That was the whole of the message. That was always the whole of it. The round went on, unhurried. His boots on the frost made the only footsteps in the village, and even those grew softer as the cold deepened, as if the night were laying straw beneath them. Lane by lane, he sewed the darkness shut behind him, a quiet stitching, older than any man walking it. The houses breathed their thin smoke. The fires slept under their ash. He passed the last gate slowly and touched it with the staff, the small, habitual blessing of wood on wood. All fast, all well. The village lay finished around him like a field after harvest. He would walk it twice more before the birds woke, and each round would find less to mend than the last, until there was nothing left to mend at all. The lantern swung, the frost held, the watch kept itself now, almost. On the meeting house steps he sat a minute, as the old man used to sit. The stone was cold through his coat. He did not mind it. From there the whole street lay in one view, roof after roof, smoke after smoke. He counted the chimneys without meaning to. All present, all breathing. Somewhere a shutter ticked in its frame and went back to sleep. The stars had shifted a hand's width since his door. That was how he told the hour, as much as any clock, by the slow wheel of them over the ridge line. The night was keeping its own accounts. He only initialed them. The street settled. The cold stood guard with him, and behind one of those dark shutters, in one of those sleeping houses, the middle of the night was drawing near, and with it an old and gentle custom of waking. It is worth stepping inside to see it. The door is on the latch. Inside one of those dark houses, the middle of the night was arriving the way it always did, without a sound anyone could name. The watchman's call had passed down the lane an hour ago and sunk into the walls. The house had taken it in and kept sleeping. Now, under the ash cap on the hearth, a coal shifted. It made the smallest noise a fire can make, a settling, a sigh of gray on gray. The warmth went on, rising through the ash in its thin, unhurried column. The house breathed. Nothing in it was awake yet, but something in it was about to be, and there was nothing wrong in that. For in those days, the old diaries and letters tell us, sleep was not one unbroken road from dark to morning. It came in two halves, like the day itself. There was a first sleep, taken soon after the fire was covered, deep and dreamless as a cellar. Then, somewhere near the middle of the night, people woke. They woke easily, without alarm, the way a boat lifts on a swell. It is said they hardly thought of it as waking at all. An hour would pass, sometimes more, in warmth and darkness and small doings. And then came the second sleep, which carried them to the birds. Nobody taught this. Nobody needed to. It was simply the shape rest took in the ages before hurry. Picture, then, this household in that hour. The goodwife woke first, as she usually did. Her eyes opened in the dark of the bed and found nothing to see, and she was content with nothing. The feather bed held her in its deep, warm hollow, and the curtains drawn around the bedstead made a small room within the room, close and dark, and smelling faintly of wool and lavender, and themselves. Beyond the curtains, the chamber was cold. Inside them, it was not. She lay a while, listening to the house, to her husband's slow breathing beside her, to the wind trying the shutter and giving up. There was no reason to move, so she did not move for a while. When she did sit up, it was without haste, the coverlet drawn with her breath showing faintly even inside the curtains. She parted them an inch and looked out at the hearth across the room. Under its gray cap, the fire showed one dull seam of red, thin as thread. Good, then. The fire had kept. She had banked it herself after supper, and a part of her, it seems, woke at this hour, partly to be told so. The old diaries speak of this small midnight accounting in 100 quiet ways. The fire, the child, the weather, the door. Wake, ask, be answered, sleep again. Her husband stirred and woke as she moved, and neither of them was surprised. They spoke, when they spoke, in voices pitched for a distance of 6 inches, voices that would not have carried past the bed curtains, let alone the walls. The frost is holding, he might say. The smoke was drawing well at supper. She might answer. Then, a silence as comfortable as the featherbed itself. Then, something about the mare, or the youngest child's cough that was mending, or the seed they meant to trade for in the spring. It was not conversation as the day knows it. Talk in the middle of the night has no argument in it and nothing to win. It is talk the way an ember is fire, banked and low, mostly warmth. After a while, she rose, sliding out through the curtains into the cold air of the chamber, her feet finding the rag rug by memory. At the hearth, she knelt and took a rushlight from the box beside the tongs. A rushlight was the humblest lamp there ever was. A peeled rush dipped in waste fat, and it cost next to nothing, which was its whole glory. She did not need flint and steel. She opened a small window in the ash with the tip of the tongs, found the seam of red, and held the rush to it, patient, until the tip caught. A little flame stood up, no bigger than a barleycorn. She set it in its iron pincer stand. The room came back faintly into being around it, shape by shape. By that small light, or by no light at all, the little works of the hour were done. It is said that women mended at this hour a few stitches by feel, thumb, and needle, knowing the seam better than the eye ever did. Some men rose to look in on the beasts, or to study the weather from the doorstone. Others simply lay back within the curtains, hands folded, and let their thoughts walk out slowly along the day that was coming, the wood to split, the stall to muck, the meal to be ground. The goodwife went to the dough trough in the corner. Under its cloth, the bread sponge for morning was working, and she pressed it with 2 fingers, once the way you would touch a sleeping child. It rose back against her touch, slow and alive. Morning was already underway in that trough. It needed nothing from her but to be left alone. She hummed as she worked, under her breath, an old psalm tune, worn smooth as a doorsill, the notes hardly finding the air. It was less singing than breathing with a shape to it. Her mother had hummed the same tune at the same hour, and hers before that, back and back. Around her the house made its own night music, and it was mostly the timbers. All day, the frame of a house warms and eases, and all night it cools. As it cools, it ticks, joint by joint. A knuckle here, a sigh there. The old people said, "A house talks to itself past midnight." They said it kindly. A house that ticked was a house settling faithfully onto its bones, doing in the dark exactly what it was raised to do. The cat came out from under the settle to see about her. It wound once past her ankle and returned to the warmth. In the trundle bed by the wall, a child turned over, murmured some small nonsense, and sank again. She listened until the breathing evened. All well there, too. Frost feathered the inside of the window glass, fine as fern leaves, and her rushlight put 1 point of gold in every pane. The room was still. It was the hour's own gift, that steadiness. Nothing asked, nothing owed. Just the ember, the dough, the ticking frame, and a woman standing in the middle of her own, kept house. And yet, even in that warmth, in that best hour, the loneliness could come. The old letters admit as much, here and there, between the lines. She stood with her fingers on the dough cloth and felt the size of the night around the house, field upon field of darkness, the road empty, the meeting house black, every window on the lane as dark as her own. Not a footstep anywhere, not a cartwheel. A person could believe, in that hour, that she was the only soul awake in the whole sleeping world. One small rushlight against all that dark, and that everyone she loved was far away from her in their sleep, even the man 6 feet behind her in the bed. The hour did not frighten her, but it could make her feel like the last light left burning. You do not forget that feeling once you have stood inside it. But here is what the diaries tell us, and it is worth saying slowly. She was not the only one. In that same hour, behind shutter after shutter down the lane, the whole village was rising toward the surface of the night together. The miller's wife was sitting up in her own curtained dark, listening to her own fire. The cooper was on his doorstone in his cloak, reading the frost. The smith's old mother had a rushlight going and stockings in her lap. The innkeeper was counting his covered coals as she was counting hers, house by house. The same waking, the same hour of ember light and low voices, the same slide back into the second sleep. None of them could see the others. None of them needed to. It was company of the truest kind, kept without a single knock, and no one in the village was ever quite alone at midnight, whatever the darkness said. Her husband's voice came low through the curtains, asking if the bread was rising. "It rises," she said. "Come back to the warm," he said. And that was all. And it was enough. And it was the whole answer to the empty road and the dark meeting house. She pinched out the rushlight and let the dark close back over the room, kindly, like water over a stone. 2 steps by memory. The curtains parted and shut. The cold stayed outside them. The warmth took her back in, as if she had never left it, and the feather bed remembered her shape. It is not sleep yet, that stage, and it need not be. Between the waking and the second sleep there lay a drowsy shelf, and people rested on it without ever naming it. Thoughts came unhooked from one another. The day to come lost its edges. Somewhere far off an owl called once and let it go. The shutter gave up its trying. Warmth did the rest. Her hand found his sleeve and stayed. That was the whole ceremony. It was enough. Every night of the year. They settled, the 2 of them, the way people settle, who have done this every night of their lives. A shoulder found its place. The coverlet was drawn to the chins. He was asleep before her, as he always was, and she lay listening a little while longer to the house ticking down towards stillness, to the wind on the shutter, to the small seam of red keeping its watch under the ash. Her thoughts loosened. The psalm tune went on without her, somewhere, just below thinking. The second sleep came up around her, like a tide over sand, and she went into it as easily as the first, and the house held them all night without being asked. There is a kind of rest that only comes when everything has been checked and found well. The fire banked, the bread rising, the child breathing, the door barred. The old diaries never boast of it, because it was too common to mention, and that is exactly why it is worth mentioning now. This was the middle of the night in that village, in those days. Not a wall against the dark, but a still hour inside it, warm, unhurried, shared by every sleeping house on the lane. The whole village rose and returned like one slow breath. Then the lane was quiet again, and the smoke ran thin, and every window was dark, and everyone was exactly where they belonged. Outside, the frost went on with its patient silvering of the fences. The watchman would pass again before dawn and find nothing to mend. And above the rooftops, above the thin threads of chimney smoke, the sky was going about its own slow work, the one work that never pauses and never tires. It is worth stepping out one last time to look at it. The stars are already up, and they have been waiting all evening. One last step, then out through the door and into the lane. The latch falls behind you with a small wooden knock. No one wakes. The cold is clean and dry, the kind that makes the sky seem swept, and the frost on the fence rail glitters faintly when you pass. Above the rooftops of the sleeping village, the whole night sky is out. It has been out there all along, of course, through every hour of this day we have walked together. But this is the first moment anyone has had leisure to look up. So look up. There they are. The stars stand over the ridgepoles, and the chimneys in their great slow wheel. thick as spilled salt in the black bright, the way they only are over a place with no lamps to argue with them, and the thin threads of chimney smoke rise toward them and give up partway. A late spark from the smithy's banked forge went up hours ago and never came near them. They are not touched by anything the village does, and the village, in turn, asked nothing of them but what it asked tonight, which was only that they be there. Here is the thing worth carrying out of this whole day, and it can be said plainly, those are your stars. The same ones, not stars like them, not descendants of them, but the very same lights that stood over those rooftops stand tonight over your own window, wherever your window is. The people of that village looked up at the end of their working days and saw exactly what you would see if you rose now and pulled back the curtain. You do not need to rise. That is rather the point. The sky has not changed hands in all the years between that lane and your room. It is the one piece of that night that has come to you whole. And the stars are not the only old things that outlived their evening. The roads of that village were older than the houses that lined them, worn first by feet and hooves before anyone thought to name them. And many of them are walked to this day. Somewhere tonight, a paved street lies exactly along the line where the watchman carried his lantern past the well. The land remembers its paths the way a bed remembers a sleeper. Houses rise and are taken down, and the road goes on underneath, patient as water. People walk it now without knowing whose footsteps they are keeping in print. No matter that they never know, the road holds the memory for them. Inside the dark houses behind you, the future is already stored and waiting in the humblest containers imaginable. Seeds sleep in their cloth pouches by the chimney, beans and flax and cabbage and corn, each pouch tied with a scrap of thread, each one a garden folded small. They ask for nothing until spring. They will get nothing until spring, and that is the whole arrangement, honored on both sides. In the corner of the kitchen, under its cloth, tomorrow's bread sponge works through the dark, rising a finger's width while everyone sleeps. Morning bread is being made right now by no one. The house does it in its sleep. That is how the whole day you have listened to was built. When you look back down its length, nothing in it happened once. The fire was banked tonight because it was banked last night and would be banked tomorrow. The cows were milked at the hour. They were milked because that was the hour, the same hands in the same order. Bread, wash, field, forge, supper, prayers, sleep. Mornings upon mornings, each one laid down on the last like coats of paint on a door until the life had a thickness to it, a shine worn in rather than put on. It was slow work. It was faithful work, and it ended every single night exactly here in darkness and rest with nothing left over. So walk the lane one final stretch, slowly, and let the day put itself away around you. The hearths are covered, everyone, red seams sleeping under gray ash until the first riser opens them like eyes. The barn holds its warm dark of hay and breath, the cows shifting their weight, the mare's ear turning once after a mouse and settling. The smithy is cold iron and quenched water, the anvil holding the last note it rang, the forge banked low. The candles are snuffed in their sticks, wicks stiff, the good beeswax pear put back in the chest for the next wedding or the next sickness. Please God, the first. The kitchen garden lies mulched under leaves and frost, its rose planned, its spring already decided. The spinning wheel rests by the window with a thread half spun and no impatience anywhere in it. The mill stands with its great stones parted for the night, the pond above the dam holding the stars flat and still on its skin. Down at the harbor, the boats lean together on their moorings, nets spread on the racks, the tide going about its small work among the pilings that no one will ever inspect. The inn's fire is raked and capped, its floor swept, its last traveler asleep above the stairs with his boots by the door. And through it, all the watchman goes his round, lantern swinging, the one moving light in the parish, stitching the lanes shut behind him. You have met them all today. Every one of them is finished. There is a moment, standing in a lane like that, when a listener might feel the old midnight unease one final tiny turn. All this ending, all this darkness, and no hand on anything. Surely something, somewhere, needs tending. Surely someone ought to be up, minding it all. It is the same thought the watchman had at the far turn of his round, the same one the goodwife had with her fingers on the dough cloth, and by now you know what the village would answer, because you have heard it answered all day in a dozen small voices. The fire keeps under the ash. The bread rises under the cloth. The seeds keep in their pouches. The watch is walked. Nothing needs you tonight. It can be said no more kindly than the village itself says it, with every darkened window on the lane. The day was completed before the light went. The wood is in, the beasts are fed, the doors are barred, the smoke runs thin and true from every chimney. Tomorrow, the whole of it will happen again. The fires opened, the bread baked, the stalls mucked, the sails raised, the wheel turning, and it will happen whether or not anyone lies awake tonight rehearsing it. That was the deep secret of that place, and it was never a secret at all. The work was a circle. The circle was closed every evening. Sleep was not the interruption of the day's labor. Sleep was its last task and its wage, and every soul in the village has already been paid. Think of how many nights this valley has folded away in just this fashion. Night after night, the same covering of coals, the same low calls in the lane, the same bread waking in the same corner. If you could stand here and let the years run past like water, the houses would flicker and change. The trees would rise and fall, and this 1 hour would keep its shape through all of it, the dark hour of rest after work. It is the steadiest thing the place ever made. Steadier than the mill dam. Steadier than the meeting house sills. Rest, done nightly, becomes a kind of architecture. It outlasts its builders. It has outlasted them. You are lying in it now. And so have you. Whatever your own day held, it is behind you now. in the same way the milking and the forge fire and the market cart are behind the village. This is not the hour for weighing any of it. The old people would not have dreamed of weighing a day at midnight, any more than they would have counted seed corn by starlight. Accounts were for mourning, and mourning would keep. The night asked one thing only, the same thing it asked of them, and it asks it gently. Lie back. Let the ash cap hold. Let the road hold its travelers, and the pond hold its stars, and let the circle close around you as it closed around them every night, mornings upon mornings, world without end. Stand a moment more if you like. The lane runs silver to the meeting house, and the frost creaks once under your feet and goes back to sleep. Far off, so low it barely reaches you, the watchman gives the hour to the empty street, and the words come to you the way they came to every sleeper on that lane, worn round with use and true as ever. All is well. He does not need you to hear it. It was never said to wake you. It slips beneath your sleep like water under ice, and it carries tonight across every year between that lane and your pillow. All is well, and all was well, and the morning knows its own way in. The smoke climbs thin from the chimneys and loses itself among the stars. Somewhere a timber ticks once, and the house it belongs to settles a hair deeper onto its stones. The tide turns without witnesses. The seeds keep their small dark counsel. The bread rises slowly under its cloth, and the ember under its ash, and neither will be seen until a morning that can manage itself. Every lane lies empty, every door is barred. Every soul on this hillside is where the night intended, deep in the first sleep or drifting into the second, and the darkness over the village is not an absence at all. It is the day, finished, holding everything it made. And if you listen, the village makes one sound only, and it is barely a sound at all. It is breath, breath of sleepers behind curtains, breath of cattle in the barn, dark breath of banked fires through 100 chimneys. A place at rest breathes like one creature. You have been listening to it this whole hour. It will go on without your listening. That too is the point. Let your own room grow quiet around this last picture of the lane. Let the lantern light go on ahead of you and out of sight. There is nothing more to see tonight, and there was never anything to fear in any of it. Only people at their slow, faithful work, and the work laid down at dark, and the dark received like a wage. The village has no more hours to give you. It spent them all, and spent them well. The wheel rests. The mill pond holds its stars. Somewhere behind you, in the dark you have already walked, the day lies folded like linen in a chest. The goodwife's coals rest under their cap of ash, keeping tomorrow warm inside them. The barn holds its animals in a single deep warmth of hay and breath. The smithy's fire has gone down to a red memory of itself, and the nails in their bin wait to hold the village together. The candles hang pale on their rods, months of light, asleep in a farmhouse kitchen. The garden keeps its seed. The wheel keeps its wool. The millstones rest one upon the other, and the stream goes on past them in the dark. working for no one. Down at the water, the hulls ride at their moorings, counted and safe. At the ordinary, the fire is banked low, and strangers sleep side by side under one roof, each dreaming of a different home. All of it is finished. All of it will begin again without effort, the way a breath follows a breath. None of it requires you. It never did. The past kept every one of these mornings, and it will keep tomorrow's as well. That is what the past is for. The last window is dark now. The watchman turns for home. The ash keeps the fire, and the fire keeps the morning. And the morning is no concern of yours. The stars stand over the rooftops, the same stars, yours and theirs. They have watched 10,000 such nights settle over this valley, and never once needed help with any of it. They do not need it now. The circle is closed. The day is done, theirs and yours. The village slept, quiet under the frost, every chimney breathing thin. The stars kept their watch. They keep it still. You do not need to remember anything you heard tonight. There will be no questions in the morning. If one small room of the past stayed with you, a hearth, a lantern, a wheel turning in the dark, let that be enough. And if nothing stayed, that is fine too. The past does not mind being forgotten. It goes on quietly either way. If you are still with us, thank you for staying. If you have already drifted off, thank you for that too. The world has been turning for a very long time. It turned through that village, and it turns through your own window tonight. It can turn without you now. You are allowed to rest. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Midnight Archive.